Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. Now on this episode, let's talk about something insidious, confusing, and absolutely maddening: Russian hybrid warfare. Because who needs to declare a traditional war when you can just troll entire countries into chaos from the comfort of your Kremlin-sponsored gaming chair? Hybrid warfare, if you haven't heard of it, is warfare for those too scared of commitment. It is war without tanks, without soldiers, without uniforms, sabotage without political accountability. So in this episode, we're taking a long look at the actions Russia is taking against Europe's north. Let's take a glance at our latest report to find out more.
In March 2023, Sweden, Denmark, Norway and Finland established the Joint Nordic Air Command, a military initiative aimed at enhancing air defense and operational readiness across Northern Europe. It unites over 250 combat aircraft from the four nations. Its creation was a move to strengthen defense capabilities in light of growing tensions with Russia in the Arctic. The High North, which lies north of the Arctic Circle, includes parts of Russia, Canada, the United States, Denmark, Norway, Sweden and Finland, and has become a key area of interest due to its strategic significance. To no surprise, the Kremlin was not happy with the increasing military cooperation among the Nordic countries. In one instance of Russian moderate enthusiasm towards the initiative, it recently sent 2 Tu-95 bombers and 2 Su-33 fighter jets approaching Alliance airspace in the High North. In response, Norwegian jets were quickly deployed to intercept the Russian aircraft. As long as NATO-Russia tensions remain, such sky games reminiscing of Cold War are here to stay.
And now, as always, it's time to explore the issue in greater detail. Recently, Russia has really been upping their hybrid warfare game, particularly around the Nordic and Baltic countries. This is not just your run-of-the-mill cyber pranksterism. We're talking anything from organized cyber-terrorism campaigns to strategic property purchases and even using religious organizations as front groups for espionage. I mean, we always knew Russia had its issues, but weaponizing real estate listings and church services, well, that's a plot twist not even a Netflix executive saw coming. Take, for example, Finland. Finnish security services recently raided properties owned by a Russian company with suspiciously close ties to the Kremlin. The locations? Oh, right next to key military and civilian infrastructure. Interesting, right? One property overlooked a major military port, you know, the kind of holiday home you buy when you're really into strategic maritime traffic or, presumably, world domination. Who knew room with a view meant front row seats to military installations? And then we've got Denmark, which found itself under cyber siege from a hacker group called Anonymous Sudan. But, plot twist, they were neither anonymous nor Sudanese. Turns out the attacks were traced right back to Russia, masquerading as outraged Muslims responding to Quran burnings. This isn't just your regular troll farm either, it's straight-up geopolitical catfishing. In Estonia, they took a slightly less digital approach, smashing car windows and defacing monuments to cause fear and instability. And don't think it's just these countries either. Lithuania, Latvia, Iceland, they've all gotten the same treatment: cyberattacks, vandalism, assaults, misinformation. Russian intelligence apparently used local criminals for these jobs, proving once again that in Putin's Russia, it is not that hard to get a job, provided your morals can actually be compromised. But here's the serious bit. This hybrid warfare is far from a little nuisance. It is a strategy aimed at undermining trust, weakening democracies, and creating confusion. It is classic reflexive control, making countries doubt themselves, hesitate in their responses, and second-guess every diplomatic move. It's basically gaslighting on an international scale. And while Western nations debate how to respond within the rules-based international system, Russia enjoys the freedom to use any and every dirty trick in the book. You see, hybrid threats are not going anywhere. Russia has found a way to fight dirty without getting its hands dirty, at least officially. So until we figure out a better way to coordinate, push back and call it out when we see it, it is likely we're going to be seeing more of these activities pretty much on a daily basis, with Russia always suspiciously near every single incident, and yet plausibly denying that it ever had anything to do with it. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Dr. Katarzyna Zysk, professor at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you.
So, hybrid warfare, this is a term that appears in the media on many occasions. And for some people, it could just be anything. But what does it mean in relation, in particular, to Nordic countries, Baltic countries? How did it manifest itself in the last couple of months?
Well, what we've seen, especially maybe since early 2024, is that Russia has escalated its attacks in the gray zone, or with the hybrid means, as it's often called, which is basically Russia is using any available military and non-military means, in particular in that sphere, to wage a war below the threshold of a direct conventional conflict. So Russia has used fake news, disinformation, tried to export corruption, influence politicians. We've seen Russian influence during electoral processes in different countries. So Russia uses this broad spectrum of especially non-military means with support of intelligence agencies to basically weaken the immune system of Western societies. This can include military sphere, but also the political sphere, informational sphere, and economy, not least. So basically, this is just a different form of waging a war. And notably, this is nothing new. Russia actually defined the contemporary conflicts as an integrated use of military, but also non-military information, economic means, etc., already in its military doctrine from 2014. So this is certainly nothing new, but again, this is something that Russia has significantly escalated over the past few months. We've seen also the Russian attempts and also successes in recruiting a local army of sometimes unsuspicious people, some criminals, to conduct, for instance, sabotage operations for Russia. We've seen assassinations in NATO countries that were sponsored by Russia. So the spectrum of actions and operations that Russia has undertaken is quite vast, in fact.
And you said that they escalated, and yet it doesn't seem like there was a specific response to this. Doesn't this mean that Russia is winning this phase of hybrid war because it is exploiting our incapability, or perhaps lack of willingness, to attribute some of the actions to Russia, or to say, okay, we know that you did it, so here are the consequences. In many cases, there were no consequences. Is Russia really this efficient in using reflexive control and our fear of escalation to basically continue to do that with impunity and not really fearing any sort of reaction from European countries?
I think there is certainly more awareness, and the European countries, NATO countries are taking this much more seriously. So I know that there is more coordination going on, both at the national level in NATO countries, but also between NATO members, also because these kind of attacks, even though we know it's been such a long time, Russia has been trying to attack from different angles, different countries, different occasions, it's certainly the sheer scale of the attacks from Russia has been quite overwhelming. And the problem with this type of attacks is that they can be quite efficient because of the plausible deniability. It's really hard sometimes to prove, even though there are strong indications that Russia was involved, it's really hard to prove that it was actually Russia that is the culprit. And in the democratic societies, that's the difference between democracy and authoritarian or dictatorships, such as Russia or China, is that you need a due process. You need to be sure to prosecute and to draw consequences and punish. So I think that's why Russia has been so skilled and used this kind of attacks on such a broad scale, namely because it's so hard for democracies to deal with this kind of challenges.
Is there any response to this which we could use? Because Russia is clearly aware of this. They know how our systems work. They also know that their own political system gives them certain advantages, at least in that particular sphere. So they will be trying to exploit this whenever they can. Is there any single approach to countering these threats? Because obviously we don't want our political systems to become like Russia's political system. So we need to find a path between respecting the rule of law on the one hand, but also attaining a certain degree of efficiency and deterrence when dealing with hybrid threats.
I don't think there is one single approach. Again, this is basically, we're talking about weaponization of all state functions. But there are many things that can be done and are being done, fortunately. So one is, you can deter this kind of attacks by denial, which means you deny Russia the success of conducting this kind of operations, which we talked about it for a very long time in Europe, in NATO, about increasing resilience of democratic societies. This concerns the information sphere, fighting fake news, being able to conduct successful strategic information also from NATO hold. We are talking about resilience of economies, energy policy, not least. We are talking about resilience of critical infrastructures, which has been also more focused on that. But there is also a deterrence by punishment, which means punishing, basically going after Russia if you can prove that Russia is behind cyber attacks or some kind of others, for instance, assassinations. Now, this is harder because, again, you have to have a proof, but I know at least on an individual level, some countries has been engaged in this kind of tit for tat with Russia, not necessarily in a symmetrical way, but also responding to the Russian attacks. So there is, it's really challenging, but there, I think, because of the Russian escalation, there has been fortunately more awareness that also the attacks we are seeing in different countries in Europe and the United States and other places, they are often a part of a coordinated campaign. Sometimes it's better coordinated, sometimes worse, but this is a part of warfare. And Russia has been speaking about that for at least a decade, waging a war against the West below the threshold of a direct conventional conflict, which is, again, another vulnerability because in the West, in Poland, in Norway and other countries, we often operate with clearly defined divisions between what is peace, crisis, and conflict. And to Russia, this is much more fluid, which, again, I think this is one of the vulnerabilities that Russia has identified in the approach to governance in Western countries. This is also something that we have to address now. And unfortunately, there is work being done in Europe on that level too.
You've mentioned the resilience of societies. Now let's talk about measures which could be directed against societies themselves as opposed to state interests, infrastructure, the military-industrial complex. So you might, for example, have Russia recruiting criminals. You might have Russia weaponizing migration, using this as a coercive factor against individual countries. Then, of course, there is the information sphere. Even instances of prank calls directed against state officials, these have been linked to the operation of the Russian state services or affiliated groups. So what would you say can we do as societies in order to be more resilient towards this? For example, Russia trying to facilitate the rise in crime rate in our countries, because this is something that's not talked about much, and yet Russia has plenty of tools to make it happen.
It's really challenging. I mean, this work has to be going on different levels. To start with, on a national level, so I think what is really important is a better coordination and information exchange between the different departments, different agencies in a single country, because they often operate with a different threat perception. They may not even understand that what is going on is actually a part of attack. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. The problem is you have to identify quickly and coordinate with other parts of the state governance. So I think we do need much more real and swift and ongoing opposed to occasional coordination and discussion between the different parts of the state governance. That's number one. And the second sort of major approach, the same should be happening on the European and NATO level. So much swifter coordination and exchange of information about the different types of attacks. So the problem with this kind of attacks is that they are not a part of warfare until these kind of tools are used as a part of warfare. So again, this swiftness and understanding of the tools that Russia is using, as you mentioned, Russia is also evolving. Russia will be also trying to identify new vulnerabilities where we will patch the holes. So this has to be an ongoing work, and basically encompassing the full spectrum of state governance, and also the coordination between the different countries. Also, we have to have the better coordinated, better unified sort of threat perception and understanding of the tactics and operations and strategies that Russia is applying.
And I have one very quick question. Are you worried that some of the arguments presented by the Russian propaganda are becoming mainstream, so that some of them are even making their way across the ocean, for example, with some US officials actually repeating these points? Whether they actually know these are Russian arguments or not doesn't really matter at this stage, but this is becoming mainstream. Do you think that this could be a cause for concern?
It's a cause for a very serious concern, and I think also the Russian emphasis on what they call information confrontation, which is much larger than information warfare. This is something that is ongoing constantly. Shows how important information and influencing how people think, politicians and the broader societies. This is something that Russia is going to increase even more attention moving ahead, because it's much easier for Russia to influence the public opinion and, for instance, help or push for a change of a government that is has policies much more favorable to Russia, as we are seeing in the United States, than, for instance, to attack an occupied country. They don't have to do it if they need to do it. So unfortunately, yes, this is a huge challenge, the fighting with the Russian propaganda. And unfortunately, they have decades of experience with that, and they are being better at using the technological tools and the new forms of social interaction and communications to amplify their methods and means. And the problem is that Russians are playing a long game, which means they can be very patient. One example is the topic of NATO enlargement. So Russia has been, of course, opposed to this process since the very beginning. And Russia actually has launched this kind of expression of NATO expansion, which sounds much more offensive, much more aggressive, rather than NATO, more neutral NATO enlargement. And, you hear this everywhere, how this kind of propaganda and this kind of phrases that Russia can coin to support the content of that phrase, which is NATO is aggressive. That's the Russian sort of propaganda. NATO is expanding, rather than actually different countries wanting actually to join NATO. Fearing,
and they've been using that as an argument against Ukraine. Unfortunately, I will have to park our conversation here due to the lack of time, but some very interesting points there, definitely worth discussing future opportunities. Professor Katarzyna Zysk was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you very much for having me.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. CIA Director John Ratcliffe has confirmed the United States has paused intelligence sharing with Ukraine, citing concerns over President Volodymyr Zelensky's commitment to the peace process. The move could weaken Ukraine's battlefield strategy against Russian forces. The freeze, however, may be temporary in nature.
The United States has paused intelligence sharing with Ukraine, a move that could hinder Kyiv's ability to target Russian forces. CIA Director John Ratcliffe stated that the freeze stemmed from US President Donald Trump's concerns about Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's commitment to a peace settlement with Russia. However, he suggested the pause would be temporary, citing Zelensky's willingness to negotiate as expressed in a letter to Trump. Despite the suspension, Bloomberg cited a Ukrainian official confirming that Washington is still sharing some intelligence.
Latvia has donated 31 vehicles confiscated from drunk drivers to support Ukraine's military and humanitarian needs. The vehicles will aid the armed forces, the National Guard, medical facilities and local administrations across multiple regions.
Valued at nearly €100,000, the vehicles will be distributed across military, healthcare and administrative sectors. Ukraine's armed forces and National Guard will receive military-use vehicles, while hospitals will benefit from additional transport. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Latvia has been a strong supporter of Ukraine, contributing military aid, including Stinger missiles, drones and howitzers. Its vehicle donation program, active since March 2023, has already delivered 676 confiscated vehicles to Ukraine, aiding both military and civilian efforts.
And finally, we have arrived at the East-splaining portion of our show. On the 17th of July 2014, Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 was shot down over eastern Ukraine by a Russian-supplied Buk missile, killing all 298 people on board. Despite overwhelming evidence linking the attack to Russian proxy forces, justice remains elusive a decade later.
The downing of Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 was one of the most brazen attacks on civilian aviation in modern history. To this day, the perpetrators have not been punished. On July 17, 2014, Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 took off from Amsterdam with a planned arrival in Kuala Lumpur. The flight path crossed over 4 countries: the Netherlands, Germany, Poland and Ukraine. At an altitude of 10,000 meters over Ukraine, approximately 50 kilometers from entering Russian airspace, the plane suddenly began to descend. At 4:21 p.m. local time, the aircraft vanished from radar screens and tragically crashed on Ukrainian territory. A joint investigation team led by Dutch Public Prosecution Service and including investigators from Malaysia, Australia, Belgium and Ukraine meticulously reconstructed the attack, tracing the missile to Russian troops in the Russian-occupied Donetsk. Yet despite this damning evidence, Russia never accepted responsibility. Instead, Moscow engaged in a systematic disinformation campaign, pushing conspiracy theories and blaming Ukraine. The Kremlin refused to cooperate with international investigators, and no Russian officials were ever held to account. The Hague District Court convicted 3 individuals, Russian warlord Igor Girkin, Sergei Dubinsky and Leonid Kharchenko, in absentia in 2022, sentencing them to life imprisonment. After the attack, the international outrage faded quickly. While Western governments imposed limited sanctions on Russia following its invasion of Crimea, they did little to push for direct accountability for the attack. Economic and geopolitical concerns outweighed the pursuit of justice. The lack of consequences emboldened the Kremlin. Russia's refusal to cooperate on MH17 foreshadowed its broader defiance of international law, culminating in its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. A decade later, the victims' families continue to mourn, and the perpetrators remain free.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Bye for now.